The wind tore across the barren plains, carrying
I've
with
come to
it the scent
protect you.
of dust and pine, a warning that something was amiss. The sun had begun its slow descent behind jagged cliffs, painting the horizon in a smear of crimson and gold, yet the beauty of the moment was lost on the young woman running as if the earth itself might swallow her if she hesitated. Her heart pounded with a rhythm that matched her feet hitting the dry, cracked soil. Behind her, the faint but relentless sound of pursuit grew louder, the occasional shout or snapping branch announcing the hunters who would see her captured or worse. Her chest heaved as she stumbled over a rock, arms flailing to keep her balance. The young woman's hair, tangled and whipping around her face, hid the terror in her eyes, though it did little to conceal the fierceness in them. She had never known fear like this, not when she was alone in the frontier towns. Not when the storms tore through her small world, not even when loneliness pressed its heavy hand against her shoulders. But this was different. These hunters were not men of law or simple greed. They were relentless, with a cruelty that burned in the air like the dry brush fires that sometimes tore through the plains. "I won't let them take you," a voice called from somewhere above the roar of her own panic. It was deep, steady, and carried a calm that was almost alien amidst the chaos. The woman froze mid-stride, ears straining. The voice came again, this time closer, firm but not frightening. "I've come to protect you." She turned her head just enough to see a figure moving through the shadows, emerging from the jagged rocks like a spirit born of the land itself. He was tall, muscular, and his skin carried the bronze hue of the sun-baked earth. His eyes, dark and unyielding, scanned her face as if he already knew her story, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. The young woman did not know whether to trust him, whether the world could possibly hold someone who was on her side, someone who could face the danger she could not outrun. The hunters' voices were getting closer. Shouts and the steady thud of boots on hard ground mingled with the occasional bark of a horse, sending a fresh jolt of terror through her veins. She looked at the man who had appeared so suddenly. His presence was a strange comfort, and yet the odds of survival seemed impossibly small. Still, the way he moved, silent, purposeful, every muscle in control, offered a glimmer of hope she hadn't dared to feel in hours. He dropped to one knee, offering a hand without a word. Something in the way he waited, patient but insistent, told her that this was not a trick. Desperation forced her decision. She grasped his hand, and in an instant he pulled her out of sight, into a narrow path carved between rocks that might as well have been walls of a fortress. They moved like shadows, their breaths short, hearts racing in the thin, cold air. "I can't lose you," he said quietly, almost to himself, as though speaking it aloud would somehow make the promise real. The woman wanted to ask him his name, to know anything about the man who had just appeared from the wilderness like an answer to a prayer she had never prayed. But there was no time. She had never been one to rely on strangers, yet in that moment she had no choice. The hunters were clever, too clever, and the terrain offered no guarantees. Twisting paths, sudden drops, and the jagged rocks made for dangerous footing, but the Apache warrior knew the land in a way she could not comprehend. He led her through hidden trails and low canyons, avoiding the open plains where the hunter's eyes would pick them out easily. The wind carried their scent, but he moved with the patience of someone who had learned to read the land as a weapon. "You're fast, but not enough," he said after a tense silence, the tone not accusatory, just matter of fact. His gaze swept over her with a mix of concern and admiration. "We need to keep moving. They will not give up." She could only nod, struggling to catch her breath, every muscle screaming from exhaustion. Fear still clung to her like a second skin, but the presence of the warrior beside her offered a strange warmth. It was not the kind of warmth one found in comfort or companionship, but in the rare certainty that someone would not abandon you, that someone could face what was coming with eyes wide open. The sky deepened into shades of violet, the first stars beginning to pierce the darkening blanket above. Shadows lengthened, folding the land into shapes that could hide both predator and prey. The woman felt the weight of the wilderness around her, vast, indifferent, dangerous, but also strangely protective. She had lived among these plains, known their beauty and cruelty, yet never like this. Never with someone beside her who seemed to understand that danger was not a momentary threat, but a presence that could last until the end of day and beyond. A sudden noise, a branch snapping too sharply, too close, made her heart leap. The warrior stopped instantly, eyes narrowing, every sense alert. He crouched low, hand brushing against the bow at his back. "Quiet," he whispered, voice like gravel rolling in a canyon. They're near. The woman pressed herself against the cold stone, barely breathing. She could see the hunters now, their forms outlined against the fading light as they searched the terrain with cruel determination. One of them raised a hand, pointing in their direction. Her stomach knotted. She realized with a jolt that their pursuers were not random. They knew where she would run, or at least they thought they did. The warrior shifted slightly, his face set in a mask of focus. "We'll circle around," he murmured. "There's a place ahead. A place where they won't follow." She wanted to ask questions. She wanted to know who he was, why he had chosen to protect her, and whether she could trust that he wouldn't vanish the moment danger arrived. But the words stuck in her throat. She didn't know if it was fear, exhaustion, or disbelief that kept them from forming. What mattered now was survival, and perhaps unknowingly, hope. They moved again, slower now, more deliberately, each step a negotiation with the unforgiving ground. The hunters' voices faded slightly, but the tension lingered, pressing against her like the very earth itself. She realized that her life, so far dictated by circumstance and misfortune, had taken a sudden turn into something far larger than herself. She had been running all her life, from expectations, from fear, from loneliness, but now she was running with someone who would stand beside her, someone who had the skill and courage to face the threat directly. A low canyon appeared ahead, its walls high and craggy, forming a natural fortress. The warrior led her inside, scanning the surroundings before signaling her to crouch behind a boulder. Silence enveloped them, save for their ragged breaths and the faint whisper of the wind. The hunters' shouts echoed in the distance, growing fainter but never entirely disappearing, like a storm moving toward them, relentless and inevitable. The woman dared to finally look at him fully, taking in the lines of his face, the sharpness of his gaze, and the strength in the way he held himself. Something inside her shifted. She wasn't just being protected. She felt, for the first time in years, that she had landed in the right place at the right moment. But the danger was far from over. One misstep, one wrong decision, and the hunters would find them, and escape would be impossible in the wilds of the frontier. "Who are you?" she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. He met her gaze but said nothing. His silence spoke volumes, carrying a weight of past battles and unspoken stories. And somehow, that silence was more reassuring than words. He had come, not for glory, not for reward, but for her. That much was clear. And in that clarity, a fragile sense of trust began to take root. Suddenly, a sharp shout broke the quiet. The hunters had noticed the canyon. Their voices grew louder, more urgent. The young woman's pulse quickened, fear twisting into pure panic. The warrior's hand went to the small knife at his belt, his stance shifting into readiness. He looked at her, the faintest hint of a grim smile touching his lips. "They're coming," he said simply. "Hold on." The woman swallowed hard, gripping the rock behind her as the sound of pursuit drew near. Her mind raced with possibilities, escape routes, hidden dangers, the uncertain loyalty of a stranger she had just come to rely upon. The canyon seemed to shrink around them, trapping them in a moment that stretched endlessly, where every sound, every shadow could mean life or death. She felt the wind pick up again, carrying with it dust and a warning. And in that moment, Standing shoulder to shoulder with a warrior she barely knew, she realized that her life had changed forever. There was no turning back, only forward into the unknown, where danger waited, and so did a promise of protection, fierce and unyielding, from the man who had appeared when she had thought all hope was gone. The first hunter's cries echoed off the canyon walls. The warrior's eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. And then, without another word, he moved toward the canyon's narrow exit, pulling her along. Every step brought them closer to confrontation and farther from safety. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a herald of the danger yet to come. And just as they reached the edge of the canyon, the hunters' figures emerged, silhouetted against the dying light. The young woman's heart leapt into her throat. The warrior tightened his grip on her hand, ready to face what was coming. And in that moment, she realized that nothing, no fear, no exhaustion, no despair, would prepare her for what lay ahead. The canyon narrowed suddenly, forcing them into a tight passage where the sun's last rays barely reached the ground. The warrior moved first, every step deliberate, his eyes scanning for traps or ambushes. The young woman followed closely, her hand still held firmly in his, the strength of his grip a quiet reassurance. Her muscles screamed with exhaustion, and every breath she took felt like a battle, but adrenaline pushed her forward. Behind them, the shouts of the hunters had faded slightly, but the echo of their pursuit lingered like a shadow she could not escape. As they moved deeper, the warrior spoke for the first time since the canyon's edge. "The land tells its own story," he said, voice low and steady. "The rocks, the trees, even the wind, everything has memory. You just have to listen." The woman glanced at him, curiosity mixing with fatigue. "Memory? What do you mean?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he paused and crouched beside a set of claw marks etched into the stone. "This," he said, pointing, "was made long ago. Predators, humans, both leave marks. If you know how to read them, you can know what is near, who has passed, and what dangers might be waiting." She leaned closer, noting the jagged scratches and the way dust had settled in their grooves. She had never thought of the world this way before, every mark, every shape, every crack in the earth carrying a hidden story. And yet, with the warrior's calm presence guiding her, she began to see what he meant. "You learned this?" she asked, voice almost a whisper. He nodded. "Since I was a child. My people taught me that the land is alive, that it watches, remembers, protects those who respect it, and punishes those who do not." A sudden rustle above made them both freeze. The woman's heart lurched. A hawk, large and silent, circled overhead, wings spread wide, casting shadows across the canyon walls. The warrior's eyes followed it, unblinking. "It watches," he said, almost to himself. "It sees everything." The woman wanted to believe in the words, wanted to feel the land as a protective force rather than a cold, indifferent one. But the hunters were still out there, still closing the distance, and no matter how much she tried, she could not shake the fear that they would never stop. Hours, or perhaps only minutes, time had become meaningless past as they wound through the canyon. The young woman's mind wandered to her own past, the life that had led her to this moment. She had grown up on the edge of small towns, where neighbors whispered more than they spoke and opportunities were rare. Her parents had been stern and distant, and she had always felt like an outsider in her own home. The world had demanded strength she was not always sure she possessed, yet somehow she had survived. Until now, she had faced challenges alone. But standing here beside the warrior, she realized that survival might not be enough. There was a part of her that longed for something more: protection, trust, connection, though the thought frightened her as much as it comforted. The warrior, sensing her thoughts, glanced at her briefly. "You carry fear," he said. "Good. It keeps you alive. But you also carry courage. That will keep you stronger." She blinked, uncertain how he could see what lay hidden in her heart. Perhaps it was his eyes, sharp and knowing, or the way he moved as though every danger in the world was no surprise. She said nothing, only nodded, feeling both exposed and strangely understood. They rounded a bend, and the canyon opened slightly into a plateau. Here, the ground was uneven but firm, and patches of dry grass offered a soft contrast to the jagged rocks they had navigated. The warrior paused, scanning the horizon. His face was tense now, every sense alert. "We cannot stop long," he said. "They will track us, but there is a place, a shelter not far ahead. If we reach it, we might find a moment to rest, to plan." The young woman wanted to ask what kind of place, what kind of shelter. Her imagination conjured images of abandoned cabins, hidden caves, or perhaps a small village. But the warrior did not elaborate. She felt a flicker of frustration, but also understood that asking questions now could slow them, and slowing down could be deadly. The wind shifted, carrying a faint, acrid smell. Smoke. Fires. Her stomach clenched. "Hunters?" she asked, voice trembling. He shook his head. "Not them. Someone else. Someone who has been here before. Watch your step." They moved carefully, the plateau opening into a rocky outcrop where the wind blew cold and sharp. Every shadow seemed alive. Every crevice might hide danger. And yet, there was a strange beauty to the landscape, a harshness that mirrored the harshness of life on these plains. She realized she had never truly seen the wilderness for what it was, not just a backdrop for life, but a force of its own, demanding respect, obedience, and caution. The warrior finally led her to a small alcove hidden behind a cluster of boulders. Inside, the space was tight, enough to sit and catch their breath, but safe enough to hide from prying eyes. He gestured for her to crouch, and she obeyed, still wary, still tense. They were silent for a moment, the only sounds the distant cries of the hunters and the whisper of wind over stone. The warrior pulled a small bundle from his pack, handing her a piece of dried meat. She accepted it, eating slowly, each bite a strange mix of relief and unease. Hunger gnawed at her, but fear suppressed her appetite. "I have been tracking them," he said quietly. "The hunters are not the only danger. There are men and women who will take advantage of anyone alone, anyone weak. That is why I came. Not for reward, not for glory. For you." She looked at him, eyes wide. "Why me?" she asked, almost incredulous. "Why risk yourself for someone you barely know?" His gaze did not waver. "Because no one deserves to face the world completely alone. And because sometimes the right moment finds you, even in the middle of danger." She wanted to argue, to insist that she could survive, that she had survived before, that she did not need someone else's protection. But the truth was undeniable. She had never run this far, never faced this much peril, and never felt so exposed. She realized with a mix of relief and fear that she needed him. And perhaps she had always needed someone like him, though she had never admitted it. Hours passed. The sun disappeared entirely, leaving the plateau bathed in silver moonlight. The hunters were still out there, their presence a distant but constant threat. The young woman shivered, not just from cold but from the tension that had never left her since the chase began. She glanced at the warrior, who seemed calm despite the danger. "You have survived before," he said, as if reading her thoughts, "and you will survive now. But you cannot do it alone." She swallowed hard, feeling a knot of emotion rise in her throat. There was fear, yes, but also a strange gratitude, a spark of trust that had taken root despite the chaos. She realized that her life was changing in ways she could not yet understand. A sudden noise startled her, a distant whistle, sharp and deliberate. She froze. The warrior's eyes narrowed, his body tensing. "They are close," he said. "We have no time to rest. We move at first light, but until then, we wait and we listen." The night stretched long and tense. The wind carried whispers through the rocks, the sound of distant hooves, the occasional crack of a branch. The young woman could not sleep, could not calm her racing mind. She thought of the hunters, of the unknown dangers the warrior had hinted at, of the life she had left behind and the uncertain path ahead. And through it all, a single thought persisted. She was no longer entirely alone. Dawn approached slowly, the first light casting long, trembling shadows across the plateau. The warrior rose, checking their surroundings with the same careful vigilance he had shown all along. "We move now," he said. His voice carried authority, certainty, and the unspoken promise of protection. The young woman nodded, gripping the pack he handed her. She followed him through the rocks, every step a careful negotiation with the wild terrain. The hunter's presence was never far from her mind, their voices a constant echo in the canyon. But with each step, she felt the faintest hint of something new hope, perhaps, or at least the confidence that someone beside her would face whatever came next. They reached the canyon's edge, the horizon stretching wide and dangerous before them. The hunters were not yet in sight, but the woman knew it was only a matter of time. The plateau opened into rugged hills, and beyond that, forests and streams she had never seen. The warrior scanned the land, eyes sharp, muscles coiled, ready for whatever lay ahead. "Stay close," he said, almost a warning, almost a promise. "Every step counts. One wrong move, and they will find us." She nodded again, heart pounding, mind racing with fear, curiosity, and a strange budding trust. She did not know who the warrior truly was or why fate had brought him to her. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she was running not just to survive, but with someone who would stand beside her no matter what. The sun rose fully, casting the first real light on the rugged landscape. Shadows shifted, rocks glimmered, and the wind carried the scent of dust, pine, and danger. And as they moved forward, the young woman understood one simple truth. Their journey had only just begun. The hunters, the unknown dangers, the challenges of the wild, all of it lay ahead. And she would face it, step by step, with the man who had come to protect her. But even as she moved, a shiver ran through her. Something in the wind, something in the rocks, hinted at threats they had yet to see, dangers far greater than the hunters who pursued them. And in the distance, a shape moved silent, deliberate, watching. The warrior's eyes caught it first, narrowing with recognition and something unreadable. "Not yet," he whispered. "Not yet." But soon. The woman's heart thudded painfully in her chest. Whatever lay ahead, it was more than either of them had faced before. And as the sun climbed higher, they pressed forward, the tension unbroken, the danger unresolved, and the story of survival only beginning to unfold. The hills stretched out before them, jagged and uneven, each rise and fall a potential trap or hiding place for those who hunted them. The young woman's legs ached, every step feeling heavier than the last, but she kept moving, driven by a mix of fear and something she did not yet fully understand. The warrior moved beside her like a shadow, his eyes scanning the horizon, noting every shift in the light, every movement in the trees, every sound carried by the wind. She wanted to ask him questions about his life, about why he had risked himself for her, but she kept them to herself. There was no time, and there might never be a time. The only thing that mattered now was survival. Yet curiosity gnawed at her, small pieces of her past brushing against the present, making her wonder if she had finally found someone she could trust. They climbed a steep ridge, the wind biting at their faces, pulling at their hair and clothes. From this height, the expanse of the frontier stretched endlessly, forests, rivers, and in the distance, a faint plume of smoke rose into the morning sky. The warrior halted, crouching behind a boulder. "They are not far," he said quietly. "The hunters, they are tracking us." "But they are not the only danger in these hills," she shivered, not just from the cold but from the implication. "Other danger?" she asked, voice trembling. "What do you mean?" He did not answer directly. Instead, he motioned for her to follow as they skirted the ridge, moving cautiously down into a narrow valley where the grass grew tall and the rocks were fewer. "There are people in these lands," he said finally, voice low, "who do not follow the same rules as the hunters. They lie, they steal, they do worse to those alone. You cannot trust anyone blindly." Her stomach nodded. She had thought the hunters were the worst of what the world had to offer, yet the warrior's words hinted at something darker, more hidden. The frontier, she realized, was not just a wilderness of wind and stone, but of people, of secrets, of threats lurking in shadows where the sun did not reach. As they moved, her mind wandered back to the brief moments she had spent alone before the warrior had appeared. She had known fear then, yes, but it had been predictable. The storms, the cold, the loneliness, they were familiar adversaries. Now, however, the danger was unpredictable, immediate, and layered. Every sound in the valley seemed amplified, the distant caw of a crow, the snapping of a twig, even the rustle of grass in the wind. She realized that survival required more than speed or strength. It required instinct, awareness, and trust in the one beside her. They reached a small stream winding through the valley, the water shallow but clear. The warrior knelt, dipping his hands into the current, drinking sparingly before offering her a cup fashioned from a hollowed-out gourd. She took it, letting the cool water wash away some of the exhaustion and heat of fear. "Even in danger," he said, eyes scanning the surrounding hills, "you must take what the land gives you. Water, food, shelter. It can be the difference between life and death." She nodded, drinking slowly, aware that the simplicity of his advice carried weight. The frontier did not forgive mistakes, and in this moment she felt the full weight of her vulnerability. As they rested briefly, the warrior's attention never wavered. He studied the surrounding trees and rocks with a sharpness that made her feel both safe and unnerved. "They are close," he said finally. "The hunters are organized, clever, but predictable. Their mistakes will be our advantage. If we can reach the forest ahead, we may find cover, a place where they cannot follow as easily." She glanced toward the horizon, where a dense stand of trees marked the edge of the plains. The thought of the forest brought both hope and unease. Forests were full of shadows and hidden dangers, but they also offered protection. "And if they reach us before then?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his grip on her hand, the silent reassurance more powerful than any words. Then he spoke, steady and unwavering. "We keep moving. Step by step. They cannot see everything. They cannot know everything. But we can." The sound of movement behind them made her heart leap, the crunch of rocks and the faint calls of men. The hunters were close. Her fear surged, and yet the warrior's calmness held her from panicking. He led her through a narrow path where the grass bent and twisted, forcing them to move slowly, carefully, almost invisibly. As they navigated the rough terrain, the warrior began to speak in a low voice, telling her stories of his past small, fragmented pieces that offered glimpses into his life. He spoke of his childhood, of learning to read the land from his elders, of the importance of patience and observation. He spoke of battles fought long ago, of friends lost, and of the responsibility that came with survival. Each word, each story, was a thread connecting her to a world she had never truly known, a world where every decision carried weight, where courage and caution were inseparable. The young woman listened, absorbing the lessons even as her body burned with exhaustion. She realized that the warrior's strength was not just in his skill with a knife or his knowledge of the land, but in his mind sharp, calculating, always several steps ahead. And yet, there was humanity in him as well, glimpses of humor and quiet reflection that reminded her he was not just a force of nature, but a person who had chosen to stand by her side. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher, the shadows shifting across the hills. They moved steadily, never stopping long, always alert. The young woman's legs ached, her lungs burned, and every sense was stretched to its limit. But she noticed small things, birds taking flight at the slightest noise, the subtle change in wind direction, the way the warrior's eyes flicked toward certain rocks and hollows. She realized that survival was a matter of noticing, understanding, and responding. A sudden movement in the trees ahead made them both freeze. A man stepped into view, tall, thin, with a knife at his belt and a cautious, calculating gaze. He did not call out, did not move further forward. Instead, he observed, studying the warrior and the woman as if deciding something crucial. The warrior did not react immediately, only standing slightly in front of her, protective but measured. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. The woman obeyed, heart pounding. She could see the tension in the man's stance, the way he weighed his options. The forest, she realized, was not just a refuge. It was also a place where danger could be concealed, where threats could emerge from any shadow. The man finally spoke, voice low, deliberate. "Traveling alone in these hills is dangerous. Even with a companion, it can be worse. Who are you, and why are you with her?" The warrior did not answer at once. Instead, his gaze flicked to her, silent question in his eyes. She felt a surge of uncertainty. She did not know if she should speak, if she could trust this stranger, if revealing anything might endanger them further. Before she could respond, the man motioned slightly, and two more figures emerged from the trees, silent and watchful. The young woman's pulse quickened. They were clearly not hunters, but something about their presence was unsettling, as though they were part of a larger network of threats she had never imagined. The warrior finally spoke, voice calm but firm. "We are travelers seeking safety. No harm has been done to anyone here. We wish only to pass." The thin man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Safety is rare in these lands," he said. "But some paths are safer than others. You may find it if you move carefully, but beware. Not all who follow the hills and forests are as honest as I am." The woman shivered. The message was clear: danger was everywhere, not just from the hunters, but from the unseen forces that roam the wilderness. The frontier was not only wild in its landscape, but wild in its people, in its rules, in its hidden motives. As the strangers receded into the forest, the warrior exhaled quietly. "We move," he said. "Every moment we stop increases risk. Trust me, we must keep going." She nodded, though fear and uncertainty churned in her chest. She realized that survival required more than running, more than following. It required understanding the land, understanding the people, understanding the delicate balance between courage and caution. They moved on, the valley stretching ahead, winding paths, hidden dangers, and the distant threat of the hunters always lingering. Each step was a negotiation with the earth, the trees, the unseen eyes of those who roamed these lands. Each breath was a reminder that safety was temporary and trust was rare. As the sun climbed high, the woman began to notice small details she had missed before: the way the wind carried sound, the way the earth shifted underfoot, the subtle cues in the warrior's movements. She realized that she was learning, slowly, to survive not just by fleeing, but by reading, by observing, by anticipating. Yet even as they pressed forward, the tension remained thick and unbroken. The hunters were still out there, somewhere in the hills, tracking them. And now, the memory of the strange strangers in the trees lingered, a reminder that danger could take many forms, and that the frontier held secrets that might never be fully understood. The warrior glanced at her once, eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "Stay close," he said. "Every choice matters, one misstep, and we will regret it." She nodded, heart pounding, aware that every sound, every shadow, every movement could signal life or death. And as they continued along the winding path, the hills and forests stretching endlessly ahead, She understood one truth. The story of survival was only beginning, and the challenges, mysteries, and dangers of the frontier were far from over. The wind shifted again, carrying the faintest scent of smoke from somewhere ahead. Her stomach knotted, fear rising once more. The hunters, the strangers, the unseen threats, they were all waiting, all watching. And yet she pressed on, step by step, alongside the warrior who had come to protect her, into a wilderness that was as beautiful as it was unforgiving, where every moment was a choice, and every choice could mean life or death. The forest thickened as they pressed forward, shadows stretching long across the uneven ground. Each step was measured, careful, yet the wind carried the faintest whispers of the hunter's pursuit. The young woman's chest heaved with exhaustion, her legs trembling from hours of relentless movement, but the warrior's presence beside her kept her moving. He was steady, precise, every sense alert, and somehow that steadiness lent her courage. The sun dipped lower, slanting through the trees, and the world seemed to shift around them. Every rustle, every snap of a branch made her heart leap. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but fear pressed down on her throat, silencing words that might betray their position. The forest was alive, not just with wildlife, but with something more, something unpredictable. She could feel it in the way the warrior paused, the way he tilted his head to listen, the way his eyes flicked to shadows that seemed empty yet felt far from it. "They are clever," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "Not just hunters. Others have learned to use fear as a weapon. They know you run, they know you hope. They know what to take from you." She shivered. "What do you mean?" she asked. He shook his head, not answering fully. "We will see soon enough. For now, stay close. Trust your instincts, and mine." The path narrowed again, forcing them to squeeze through dense undergrowth. The forest pressed in around them, thick trunks and low branches forcing them to duck and twist. Every shadow was a potential threat, every rustle a possible ambush. The young woman's mind raced, imagining the hunters striking from behind a tree or a hill. She felt the weight of the wilderness pressing down on her, suffocating yet mesmerizing. A sudden cry pierced the air, sharp, urgent, and terrifying. The warrior's eyes snapped toward the sound, muscles tensing. "Move," he ordered, voice low but commanding. Now they ran, weaving through the trees, feet pounding the forest floor, leaves whipping against their faces. The sound came again, closer, and the young woman realized it was the hunters, or at least one of them, calling, trying to flush them out. Her stomach knotted with fear, but adrenaline lent her legs strength, and she followed the warrior without hesitation. They reached a small clearing, and the warrior paused, scanning the edges of the forest. "We have to cross this," he said, nodding toward a shallow stream cutting across the path. "Quickly, quietly." She nodded, gripping her pack, heart hammering. The water was cold, running over smooth stones, and every splash seemed magnified, echoing through the clearing. She moved carefully, step by step, feeling as though the slightest misstep would betray them. The warrior crossed first, silent and sure, then helped her over with a firm hand. On the far side, the trees thickened again, and they plunged into the shadows. For a moment, she allowed herself a small sense of relief, but it vanished instantly when she heard the hunters' voices behind them, closer than before. They were gaining. She could feel it in the tension in the air, in the subtle vibrations of the ground beneath their feet. The warriors slowed, crouching behind a massive tree. "We can't keep running blindly," he said. "We need a plan, a place where they can't follow easily. There is a hidden ravine ahead. If we reach it, we can make a stand. Or disappear entirely." Her stomach turned. "A stand?" she whispered. He nodded. "If it comes to it, yes. We may have to fight. But if we can stay quiet, we can avoid it." They moved again, the forest closing in around them. Every sound was magnified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a bird startled by their passage. The young woman's pulse pounded in her ears, and she realized how fragile their safety was. The forest, for all its protection, could just as easily betray them. Suddenly, a figure stepped onto the path ahead, tall, thin, and moving with deliberate stealth. The young woman froze, and the warrior's hand shot out, pulling her behind him. The man stopped a few feet away, eyes scanning. Then he spoke, voice low and cautious. "You should not be here," he said. "These hills are dangerous for those unprepared." The warrior stepped forward slightly. "We do what we must. Step aside, and we will pass without trouble." The man's eyes flicked to the young woman, and she felt a chill. There was a sharpness there, a calculation, as if he was measuring not just her physical presence but her will, her strength, her fear. Finally, he nodded slowly and stepped aside, disappearing into the shadows. The warrior exhaled quietly, tension easing slightly. "We are not alone," he murmured. "There are others in these hills, watching. Not all of them friendly." She nodded, trying to steady her breathing. Why are you helping me?" she asked, voice trembling. He looked at her, eyes steady. "Because no one should face the wilderness alone, and because sometimes protection is not a choice. It is a duty." They moved on, deeper into the forest. Hours passed. The canopy thickened, blocking the sun, and the air grew cooler and damp. The forest floor was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip them at every step. The young woman's legs burned, but she kept moving, driven by a mix of fear and trust. Then the distant sound of voices reached them, hunters, close, relentless. The warrior paused, listening, every muscle taut. "They are near," he said. "We cannot outrun them forever. We must use the land, the shadows, the tricks we know." She followed him without question, though terror pressed against her chest. The forest seemed to shift around them, every tree a potential ally or enemy. They moved through hidden paths, small ravines, and dense undergrowth, each step bringing them closer to a place where they might finally find safety or be forced into confrontation. The young woman noticed the warrior's subtle signs, how he brushed away loose leaves, how he avoided certain paths, how he kept his eyes constantly moving. She realized that he was not just skilled, but deeply connected to the land, seeing patterns she could barely comprehend. Every step he took was calculated, every decision deliberate, and somehow that gave her a thread of hope in the midst of fear. As night approached, they reached the hidden ravine. It was narrow, with steep sides covered in dense foliage. The warrior led her down carefully, each step measured. "Here," he said, "we can wait, we can rest, we can prepare." They crouched among the shadows, the forest closing in around them. The hunters' voices echoed faintly above, but the ravine offered concealment. The young woman allowed herself a moment of relief, though the tension in her body did not fully fade. She knew this was only temporary. The warrior began to speak softly, sharing stories of his people, their ways, and the lessons of the land. Each tale was a thread, connecting the young woman to a world she had never known. She listened, captivated, finding comfort in his words even as the danger lingered. Hours passed. The wind shifted, carrying distant cries and rustling leaves. The young woman felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down, but also a strange sense of anticipation. The danger, the unknown threats, the hunters, they were all converging, and the story was building toward a moment she could feel in her bones. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the top of the ravine. The young woman froze. The warrior's eyes narrowed, and he motioned for her to stay low. The hunter's silhouette appeared, scanning the ravine carefully. The tension was unbearable, every heartbeat a hammering drum of fear and anticipation. The hunter moved on, but the young woman realized that this was only a temporary reprieve. The confrontation was coming. The forest, the hills, the hunters, and the hidden dangers of the land were all aligning toward a single point of reckoning. She glanced at the warrior, his face set in determination and vigilance. "We are ready," he said quietly. "No matter what comes, we face it together." Her heart surged with a mix of fear and resolve. She had come to rely on him, to trust him, and to understand that the wilderness was not just a place of danger, but a test of courage, skill, and connection. The wind shifted again, carrying faint whispers of movement from above. The hunters were closing in. Other unseen forces were waiting. Every choice, every breath, every step mattered. The young woman gripped the warrior's hand, finding strength in his presence. "I'm ready," she whispered. He nodded, eyes scanning, muscles coiled. "Stay close, watch, listen. We move when the moment comes." The forest seemed to hold its breath. The hills echoed faint cries and the rustle of unseen movement. The young woman's heart pounded in her chest, every sense alert, every instinct sharpened. She knew the climax was near, the moment when danger and courage would collide, and the story she had been living would change forever. And as the shadows deepened, the hunters' cries drew closer, the wind shifted again, and the first stars began to pierce the night sky. She understood that the moment of reckoning, intense, dangerous, and life-changing, was almost upon them. The night was quiet now, but the tension lingered like a weight pressing down on the forest floor. The young woman crouched beside the warrior in the hidden ravine, her muscles sore, her lungs burning, but her mind sharper than ever. Every sound, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, even the soft sigh of the wind, was a signal to notice, to anticipate. She had learned in these hours and days of running how to read the land, how to sense danger, how to trust her instincts and the judgment of the warrior beside her. The first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, painting the forest in muted gold. Shadows shifted, the air smelled of dew and damp earth, and the world seemed poised on the edge of something monumental. The hunters' voices, closer the night before, were now distant echoes, retreating or regrouping, she could not tell. The warrior remained alert, scanning every rise and fall of the land, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a quiet confidence, not arrogance, that suggested the immediate danger had passed. She looked at him, studying his face in the early light. He had been a mystery from the first moment she saw him, strong, calm, unyielding, and yet full of subtle kindness. Over the past hours, he had shared fragments of his life, lessons from his people, and strategies for survival that had kept them one step ahead of the hunters and hidden dangers of the forest. She realized, with a mix of gratitude and awe, that his courage was not just physical. It was the courage to act when others fled, to protect when others might have looked away, to move forward even when the unknown threatened every step. "We made it this far," she said quietly, almost to herself. He glanced at her, eyes softening. "Yes, but we are not finished. The forest can hide, but it can also reveal. We must keep moving until we are certain of safety." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words. Safety was never guaranteed on the frontier, and the lessons she had learned about the land, about trust, about courage would guide her in the moments to come. They moved slowly now, alert but careful. The forest was thick, but the ravine had brought them closer to a small clearing, a natural shelter that offered a view of the surrounding hills and a place to rest without fear of immediate attack. The warrior led her there, crouched low, scanning the perimeter before signaling her to sit. "Drink," he said, offering a small gourd of water. "Eat if you can. Strength will be needed." She accepted it, sipping carefully, feeling the cold liquid revive her weary body. She tore off a piece of the dried meat he had rationed earlier and ate slowly, savoring the small relief in the midst of tension. She glanced at him, noticing the way he rested briefly, shoulders tensed, eyes never leaving the tree line. "You've taught me so much," she said softly, "about the land, about watching, listening." About surviving. He gave a faint smile, rare and fleeting. And you've learned quickly. That is why we have lasted this long. Fear is natural, but courage. Courage is knowing what to do when fear is strongest. A soft rustle from the edge of the clearing made her heart leap. She turned sharply, but the warrior held up a hand. Not yet, he whispered. It is not them. A small figure emerged from the shadows, a boy no older than 12, barefoot, with wide, anxious eyes. He looked at them for a long moment, then bowed slightly. I mean no harm, he said quietly. I saw you coming. The hunters have passed through here. They do not know I am near. You must leave. The warrior's expression softened slightly. Thank you for warning us, he said. You have courage to speak, the boy nodded. They are many. They will return. You cannot stay here. The young woman's heart sank. She had hoped that reaching this clearing might mean safety, but the truth was clear. The forest offered only temporary refuge. The hunters would return, and danger was never far. We must move, the warrior said, voice firm. The forest is our ally, but only if we respect it. Follow me. They left the clearing cautiously, moving through dense undergrowth, listening for any sign of the hunters or other dangers. The young woman felt a mixture of fear and determination. Each step reminded her of how far she had come, of how much she had endured, and of the courage she had discovered in herself. The terrain changed as they moved, becoming more rugged, the hills steeper. She stumbled a few times, but the warrior's steady hand was always there, catching her, guiding her, supporting her. She realized that survival was no longer just about running, it was about partnership, trust, and the quiet understanding that one was not alone. By midday, they reached the edge of a small river, wider and deeper than the stream they had crossed before. The water ran fast, clear and cold, and the surrounding banks were high, offering natural concealment. The warrior studied the river carefully, noting the currents, the rocks, the potential crossing points. This will slow them if they follow, he said. And if we move carefully, it can hide us from sight. But crossing will be dangerous. The young woman nodded, swallowing hard. Every choice now mattered. One misstep could mean capture or worse. She followed his lead as he stepped carefully into the shallow edge, testing each stone. She mimicked his movements, feeling the icy water rush over her boots, muscles straining to keep balance. Halfway across, the water surged unexpectedly, splashing over her ankles. She gasped, slipping slightly, but the warrior's hand caught hers instantly, steadying her. Careful, he said. Eyes ahead. Focus. Together they reached the opposite bank, breathless but unharmed. The forest rose before them, dense and green, and for the first time she felt a real possibility of escape. The hunters might pursue, but the river, the terrain, and their knowledge of the land gave them an advantage. They paused to rest briefly, the young woman leaning against a tree, feeling the adrenaline ebb slightly. She looked at the warrior, noticing the small scars along his hands and forearms, the lines of experience etched into his face. She realized that he had faced countless dangers before, yet here he was, standing with her, guiding her, protecting her. Why did you risk yourself? She asked again, quietly. Why me? He regarded her for a long moment. Because I have seen what happens to those who face the world alone, he said. Because courage is not only for oneself, and because sometimes fate chooses moments to connect people who need each other. You needed help, and I was in the right place to give it. She felt a warmth in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and understanding. She had never thought of the world this way before, where acts of courage, even small ones, could change lives, could create bonds strong enough to endure fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. The sound of distant movement brought them back to the present. The hunters were not far, but they had crossed the river, and the terrain slowed them. The warrior led her through thick underbrush, following hidden trails until they reached a small clearing high above the river valley. From here, they could see the forest stretching endlessly, the river winding below, and the distant hills fading into the horizon. "This is as safe as we can make it for now," the warrior said. "We wait, we watch, and we move only when we are certain of the path." The young woman breathed deeply, the tension of the past days slowly giving way to relief. She had survived, not just through skill and luck, but through trust, courage, and the guidance of someone who had risked everything to protect her. As they settled, she noticed the first real smile on his face, small but genuine. "You have grown stronger," he said. "Faster than I expected." "You have courage." She smiled back, a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "I had a good teacher," she said softly. The hours passed quietly, the sun rising higher and warming the forest. Birds called in the distance, and the wind whispered through the trees. For the first time in days, the young woman allowed herself to hope, not reckless hope, but the kind that comes from surviving, learning, and knowing that someone stands beside you. When the hunters' voices finally faded into the distance, the young woman let herself exhale fully. The danger had not vanished entirely, but the immediate threat was gone. The forest, once oppressive and threatening, now felt like a companion, a place of both challenge and protection. The warrior studied her, expression softening. "You are ready for the next step," he said. "But it is your choice. The path ahead is yours to take, and I will be here." She looked at him, gratitude and trust shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." He nodded, and together they began to move again, carefully, deliberately, toward the next part of the wilderness. The lessons of survival, trust, and courage would guide them, and the bond forged in fear and danger would endure. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light over the hills and forest. The river sparkled below, the wind whispered through the trees, and the horizon stretched endlessly, full of possibility. For the first time, the young woman felt not just relief, but a quiet certainty that she had survived, learned, and grown stronger, and that she was not alone in facing the challenges ahead. And as they walked side by side through the forest and toward the unknown, she realized that the wilderness, the danger, the fear, all of it had led her to something she had never truly known before: trust, courage, and the beginning of a life that could be hers, fully and unafraid. The horizon ahead promised new challenges, new discoveries, and a future shaped not just by survival, but by choice, courage, and the strength found in human connection. And for the first time, she knew that whatever lay ahead, she would face it with someone who would stand beside her unwavering, protective, and steady through every storm the world could throw at them.